You want to dive into the stories and myths behind Professor Scienza's new series, but Italian isn't your thing. No problem. You find all the conversation translated in English in the new Mama Jumbo Shrimp book, An Italian Wine Pilgrimage with Professor Attilio Scienza. Now available in English on Amazon.
Tension has not disappeared. The wine industry still wrestles with the balance between tradition and innovation. Producers today continue asking the same essential questions. Do we protect identity by preserving the rules exactly as they are? Or do we protect identity by allowing great producers to respond to the climate, market, and changing taste with intelligence and courage? That is why this chapter still matters. Super Tuscans are not important simply because they were rebellious. They were important because they proved that disruption can force a region and eventually an entire country to raise its standards.
Welcome to a special series on the Italian Wine Podcast. In this series, Italian wine ambassador Ryan Robinson reads and reflects on the art of wine storytelling, the latest book by renowned scholar Professor Attilio Scienza. From the myths of ancient Greece to the language of modern wine communication, the book explores how storytelling shapes our understanding of wine, and why these stories matter more now than ever. Let's begin the journey.
Welcome to the Art of Wine Storytelling on the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Robinson. In this series, we continue our journey through Professor Attilio Scienza's remarkable work, exploring not just the history of wine, but the deeper stories, symbols, people, and turning points that have shaped the culture of wine as we know it today. In today's episode, we move on to the next 3 chapters that feel especially relevant for the modern wine world. First, we'll explore the renaissance of Italian wine through the history of Super Tuscans, a story of rebellion, ambition, and the courage to challenge a rigid system. Then we'll turn to Pierre Viala's and his viticultural mission in America, a chapter that reminds us that wine history is all scientific exchange, adaptation, and survival. Finally, we'll close with the border metaphor, which invites us to think about wine not as something fixed and isolated, but as something that is constantly shaped by movement, tension, identity, and cultural encounter. These chapters matter because they help explain how wine evolves, not only in the vineyard or cellar, but in response to rules, crises, geography, and of course, human imagination. They also remind us that some of the most important moments in wine history begin when someone is willing to cross a line, whether that line is legal, scientific, even cultural, or territorial. So let's jump into the reading. The Renaissance of Italian Wines through the history of Super Tuscans. The first Super Tuscans, Sassicaia and Tinello, are the result of the intuition of Mario Incisa della Rocchetta, and of course, Niccolò Antinori, and the chronological wisdom of Emile Peynaud and Jacques Motakis. Before them, this innovative way of making a Tuscan wine other than Chianti was shrouded in mystery. Many companies had begun to introduce foreign vines into the Chianti blend, but in an almost clandestine way. At a conference attended by Luigi Veronelli in the early 1980s in San Felice, some companies that imported mainly to the United States began to talk publicly about these wines, and Chianti was thrown into a crisis. At the end of sharecropping and with the introduction of the DOC wine legislation, the reconstruction of Tuscan viticulture, supported by the Fondo, also known as the FEOGA, started off on the wrong foot. Sangiovese propagation material of modest quality, wide planting layouts, production of vines per hectare too high to provide grapes suitable for a quality wine. Foreign consumers were deserting Chianti. The large companies began to remove the white vines from the famous Ricasole blend and began to experiment with the contribution of international varieties such as Cabernet and Merlot to give Sangiovese a greater chromatic stability, and an aromatic profile, also with the help of the barrique. Mario Incisa de la Roqueta's experience as a winemaker began with the desire to produce a wine to offer on the occasion of the resounding victories of his horse, Reebok, at racecourses all over the world. He was tired of toasting with the wines of his competitors, especially Bordeaux. He began by planting a vineyard in the eastern side of the Castle of Castiglioncello, using Tuscan vines such as Caniolo, Sangiovese, and Trebbiano. The result was modest. The wines were often Ascent, and Veronelli, his mentor to whom he turned for an opinion, was very critical of him. A dense correspondence testifies to the sometimes harsh confrontation. Chance, or perhaps the meeting with Amélie Pinaud, who was then a consultant for the Antinori. Mario was a brother-in-law of Niccolò Antinori, Piero's father. So he convinced him to cultivate vines other than those of Tuscany, and a relationship with Count Salvatore di Maggiaro of Pisa made him aware of the wines of Cabernet grown in those lands. With the cuttings of the vines of the vineyards of the Salvatore counts, he planted the first in a plot called Sassicaia, not far from the sea. In 1968, with the help of Takis and the encouragement of Veronelli, he presented himself at an important competition in London, in which he beat all the best Bordeaux chateaux. This success was repeated in 1985 in a comparison with Cabernets from all over the world. Where's the novelty in having won despite the constraint of tradition imposed on Tuscan wines? But above all, in communicating without hesitation or sense of inferiority, telling a beautiful story, where together with his audacity, horse racing exploits, innovative cultivation, and winemaking experiences, takes on the most important markets in the world, and many anecdotes, a true success story. Peter Villa's viticultural mission in America. Among the modern heroes, it is also necessary to include scientists and researchers to relate through their fascinating stories the progress of viticultural science. Among these, Pierre Villa occupies a preeminent position. His journey took him to the United States in the second half of the 1800s, in search of the wild vines needed to rebuild European viticulture threatened by phylloxera. From 1874, with the plantings of the first vineyards on American rootstock, the first serious symptoms of yellowing began to appear due to the difficulty of the rootstocks then present in France to absorb iron from the soil. In 1887, Villa, a 28-year-old professor of viticulture at the ANA in Montpellier, left the United States with the sole objective of finding wild species capable of tolerating the limestone present in high quantities in two important French wine-growing regions, Champagne and the Charente. Before starting this journey, Violet stopped for a week in Washington at the Federal Geological Survey to ascertain where the calcareous soils were that might be comparable with the calcareous marly soils of France. He found something analogous in a territory between Missouri and the Rocky Mountains, from Montana to Texas, whose geological origins is to be found at the beginning of the Mesozoic era in the Jurassic. As with Champagne, the soil was formed by the filling of a depression, by the tectonic origin of the Rocky Mountains, by the acclimation of marine deposits and landslides that slipped down into the slopes of the mountains. For 6 months, from the 5th of June to the 3rd of December in 1887, Viola traveled the United States, but focused his attention on Texas, the last area he visited, where he met the French-Mexican anthropologist Jean-Louis Berlandier, who helped him find those places in central Texas where vines remain green and vigorous in marly soils. The conditions of the journey were very difficult, involving long stays in hostile and uncivilized places, high temperatures that reached up to 45 degrees Celsius, and encounters with a savage landscape populated by wild animals. The mission report is full of fascinating observations, but above all, it managed to bring to Europe numerous seeds of wild vines, Avitis berlandieri. This could be used for the creation of hybrids of rootstocks suitable for southern and calcareous environments and would be decisive for the development of continental viticulture. It is not difficult to see in Viola's scientific mission in America the narrative model of the hero. In this case, it is not the meta history, even if the elements of adventure and risk remain due to the presence of hostile indigenous populations and rattlesnakes. Viola is a hero in search of himself. The anti-hero, in this case, are the opponents of grafting, the obstacles that the hero must overcome, the feat accomplished to discover the treasure or the truth event, also thanks to the help of a companion, and the final prize to crown the feat, the creation of new rootstocks. The border metaphor. The metaphor of the border is fundamental to telling how civilization of wine developed in Europe, and particularly the origins of cultivated vines. Borders are notoriously places of crisis, ethnic tensions, contrast, but also of exchange, regulations of different systems, innovation. It is a cultural paradox that can be at the same time a place of separation, involving the creation of so-called parallel societies, and of encounter and infusion. There are countless elements that define a boundary, in addition to spatial boundaries represented by obstacles to movement such as seas, mountain ranges, deserts, rivers. Cultural, religious, and linguistic boundaries are more difficult to overcome. Heidegger, in an essay published in 1954 referring to the colonial experience of the Greeks in Italy, wrote, "A boundary is not that at which something stops, but that from which something begins." To represent something that separates and unites at the same time, it is necessary to identify a sort of no man's land, a place between two spaces, not necessarily geographical, each of which is occupied by a society or culture distinct from one another. As a rule, the strongest culture has an intrusive action, and in its expansion, movement presses on neighboring societies, and therefore, in the case of the vine, it is the Roman Empire that exports its viticulture model to neighboring regions. In its definition, we make no distinction in the meaning between border, frontier, and limes. A confine is a shared space where two cultures that come in contact integrate and give rise to a new culture. Many grape varieties were born thanks to those interactions. The opposite is the border, where two cultures meet, facing each other but do not merge, opposing each other. Over time, the expression of these viticultural cultures remains unchanged, allowing us to trace their origin. The limes is instead a physical limit, where the differences are represented by mountains, rivers, and seas. Significant limes are the islands or valleys that are difficult to cross and represent hidden frontiers, places of isolation and conservation. Anthropologists call these cultural expressions the edge effect. Italy, with its position between west and east on the path of populations that have always crossed it, with the countless cultural and productive manifestations of its viticulture, is the most effective illustration of the outcome of the encounter between different cultures. Such were the Roman limes along the Rhine and the Danube, or in the case of Termino in South Tyrol, whose name derives from the Latin word terminus, which indicated a geographical or political border for the Romans, in the process of expansion to conquer the rest of Europe. Even the German translation of Collio, den Ecken, the corner hides its identity as a place located on the margin on a border. Italy is still rich in those borders. Just think, for example, of the hidden borders that separate Latin viticulture from Greek viticulture on the island of Ischia, or from that of the Etruscan enclave of Capua, surrounded by the territories of the Araterici. The same can be said of the clear line of demarcation between Lombard-inspired viticulture west of Bologna and the Byzantine viticulture up to the Adriatic Sea. Curiously, the border between the viticulture of Slovenia and the Brda does not represent significant features of distinction today except for the language, but the sharing of Ribolla as an identity vine of the two territories cancels the perception of any differences. In fact, in search for the elements that allow the identification of the so-called hidden boundaries, various indicators are used. These include terminology, the use of different types of tools for pruning, and winemaking, like the castle and the ship for the transport of grapes and wine in the Po Valley, and the types of press. Also of great cultural interest is the border in the Salento region of Puglia, where different burial habits were practiced on either side of the border. A few kilometers separated two peoples who honored their dead either with incineration or by burying them standing with their faces turned east in pits dug into the limestone. The former symbolically extinguished the pyra with the wine by breaking the climax of the offering. The latter did not include any ceremony. The vines that are still present in the territories occupied by these two peoples are different, as are the winemaking techniques. Even the dichotomy of the landscape, marked by the two forms of sapling or tree training, made it possible to highlight the distinctive features of the viticultural types. Vines, the characteristics of the wines, of the peoples who had come into contact. The island of Ischia is exemplary in this regard. On the two geological matrices that characterize it, the tectonic one and the result of the emergence of the sea, the Greeks who settled used the clays of the Fleisch to make amphora, while on the volcanic one, an expression of the intense volcanism of Campania. The Etruscans and Romans worked the iron that came from Elba. From this side, from the Neo-Latin linguistic connotations, at the end of the historical cycle of the Bronze Age, all the ships that brought iron into Greece for the manufacture of weapons departed. Where the Etruscans worked, the vine was grown on a phalanx, very high chestnut supports in the fashion of Paleo-Ligurian viticulture. While in the part of the island inhabited by the Greeks, there was also the lexical substrates of the Eastern Mediterranean and of the Caucasus prior to the Greek one. The vines were pruned to sapling or low espalier, locally called latina. These two different forms of training were divided by road, which still exists today, which has made it possible to keep the original substrates miraculously intact. From the methodological point of view, an ancient grape variety, even if no longer cultivated and present as a relic in a collection, can represent an effective indicator of the excellence of a cultural boundary in European viticulture. Now, let's come back through these chapters in order to connect them with how do they apply to the real world of wine in which we live today. So, reverting back to chapter 25, the summary, the Renaissance of Italian wines through the history of Super Tuscans. This chapter captivates one of the great turning points in modern Italian wine. The Super Tuscan story was not just about making expensive wine or using international grape varieties, it's about pushing them back against a system, at the time, that often rewarded conformity more than excellence. Wines like Sassicaia and Tinanello help shift that conversation from single appellation obedience to a bigger question, and that question of what actually generates greatness in a bottle. Sassicaia's roots go back to Mario Cesare della Rocchetta's plantings at Tenuta San Guido, while Tinanello became one of the iconic symbols of Tuscany's modern turn. So together, these wines help bring international attention and a new vision for what would become Italian fine wine. This is so applicable today is that tension has not disappeared. The wine industry still wrestles with the balance between tradition and innovation. Producers today continue asking the same essential questions. Do we protect identity by preserving the rules exactly as they are? Or do we protect identity by allowing great producers to respond to the climate, market, and changing taste with intelligence and courage? That is why this chapter still matters. Super Tuscans are not important simply because they were rebellious. They were important because they proved that disruption can force a region and eventually an entire country to raise its standards. In today's wine industry, that call to action is clear. Do not confuse tradition with stagnation. I think the best wine professionals, growers, and communicators need to ask harder questions. They need to reward authenticity over bureaucracy and stay open to the possibility that the next great leap forward may begin outside the comfortable boundaries of the current system. Stepping into chapter 26, Pierre Viola's viticultural mission in America. So this chapter brings us into the history of wine's most powerful reminders that survival often depends on both humility and collaboration. Pierre's mission in America was tied to the devastation of phylloxera. European vineyards were forced to confront the reality that they could not solve the problem alone. His work and the broader French search for resistant American rootstock became part of the effort that ultimately helped save European viticulture, or helped save worldly viticulture. The mission underscored that American vine species were not a curiosity on the margins, they were essential to the future of Old World wine. That is an extraordinary lesson, I think, for today's wine industry. We often talk about heritage with reverence, and rightly so. But this chapter reminds us that heritage survives because people are willing to learn, adapt, sometimes accept answers from unexpected places. Wine is never only local. It has always been connected to a wider network of science, travel, exchange, and shared vulnerability. The modern application here is urgent. With climate pressure, disease pressure, water scarcity, and definitely labor challenges, and of course shifting consumer behavior, are all pushing the wine world into another era of adaptation. The professionals who will matter most in the next chapter of wines will be the ones who stay curious, respect research, and build bridges between tradition and science. The call to action from this chapter is simple but powerful. Stop treating innovation as a threat to the wine's soul. In many cases, innovation is exactly what allows the wine's soul to endure. And then chapter 27, the border metaphor. This chapter expands the conversation beyond grapes and producers and into the philosophical heart of wine. The border metaphor is so compelling because borders do two things at once. They separate, but they also connect. So in the wine world, borders can be national, regional, linguistic, political, cultural, or even stylistic. They define identity, yet they also create points where exchange happens. Modern scholarships on border wines and terroir across contested territory makes a similar point. Wine is often shaped where territory, identity, and place are being negotiated rather than passively inherited. And this is deeply relevant right now. The wine industry today is living in the borderlands all the time. Think about the wines from frontier regions, cross-cultural winemaking teams, imported grape varieties, migrant labor, global wine sales markets. Hybrid identities are coming to the surface, and consumers are no longer loyal to one region or just one narrative. Even the way wine is sold has changed. A bottle no longer competes only inside its denomination. It competes across countries, it competes across styles, across price categories, and across digital storytelling ecosystems. What this chapter asks us is bigger than memorizing maps. It asks us to become better interpreters, better listeners, better storytellers, and better students of complexity. The modern call to action here is that wine professionals need to stop speaking about borders only as lines on a map. Borders are where meaning is made. If you want to understand the future of wine, then pay attention to the places where cultures meet, where traditions are challenged, and where identities are still being negotiated. That is often where the most compelling wine stories begin. While you're still listening, my final call to action. Taken together, these three chapters challenge us to think differently about wine leadership. The Super Tuscan story tells us that progress sometimes begins with principled defiance. Pierre's story tells us that wine survives when people are willing to learn beyond their own world. The broader metaphor tells us the most interesting stories in wine often emerge where categories blur and identities meet. So here's the challenge for all of us listening today. Whether you're a sommelier, importer, educator, producer, sales rep, student, or simply just someone who loves wine, do not engage with wine passively. Ask what rules need rethinking. Ask what knowledge you have dismissed because it came from somewhere else. Ask what borders, literal or metaphorical, are shaping the wines you drink and the stories you tell. Because the future of wine will not belong to the people who simply inherit tradition. It will belong to the people who can understand it, question it, translate it, and then carry it forward with courage. With that, I want to thank you for joining me for episode 9 of the Art of Wine Storytelling on the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Ryan Robinson, and as always, it is a privilege to walk through these chapters with you from the book of Professore Attilio Scienza's and bring their meaning back into the context of today's wine world. If this episode resonated with you, stay with us. These stories are not just about the past. They are tools for understanding where wine is going next and what our role in the future can be. Until next time, keep reading, keep tasting, and keep telling stories that give wine its meaning.
You've been listening to The Art of Wine Storytelling by Professor Attilio Scienza, read and commented by Ryan Robinson. The book is available now on our site, Mama Jumbo Shrimp, and Amazon. Follow the Italian Wine Podcast on all the major platforms so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to rate and review us.